And then we get into the civil rights era. Brown versus the Board of Education. People of African descent have always known that if you give a child education, that's something that you can't take away. So there was always a focus on trying to keep the masses as ignorant as possible. The whole notion of a public education system, which again, I should have put this on here. The public educational system in the United States of America was actually started by Christians because Christians understood. I mean, real Christians. I'm not talking about the fake ones that have become the face of Christianity in America, but the real Christians, and that also is the same with regard to the social programs, the social workers, if you will, uh, orphanages, anything that had to do with taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves, that came out of a desire to be human and see other people as human. It's the ruling class that never wanted those things. So the idea of education in the community that has been labeled as Black, education was always important. Reading and writing was always important. And so they knew that the resources for educating people were in the other community. That's why they wanted integration. They didn't want to integrate so that they could be with white people. They wanted to integrate the dollars so that the textbooks that they used were comparable to the textbooks in the white community, that the physical plant that they sent their children to actually had heat in the wintertime. So that is why the desegregation piece became important. And so Brown versus the Board of Education had much more to do with that than some aspirations of a handful of people that just wanted to be as close to white people as they could. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation in employment, was extremely important. That is what allowed people to make a decent living. It wasn't for anything else but that. That's what drove the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. Again, voting has always been a problem for us because those who are in control of the society know how important voting is. It wasn't what their intent was, and now they have pretty much cleaned that up so that in 2025, the reason why you have all of these state legislatures that are right-wing focused, and again, when you map those legislations in the states with who the slave states are, it's almost a perfect match. But it also goes up into the northern areas as well, in Ohio, in Illinois, in Pennsylvania. So, but the heart and soul of this is still coming from the land owning Southerners. As some people have said, the South may have lost the military war, but they won the war overall. And everything that I see is indicating that's true. Fair housing, getting back to even in the town in which I was raised, many of my people literally lived in shacks that were worse than shacks in South Africa. They lived along the railroad tracks. That's that whole notion of across the tracks. That is where the Black community was relegated to the worst housing, the worst infrastructure. That was by design. It wasn't because Black people wanted to live that way. They had no other choice. So this Fair Housing Act came along at a time that could be addressed. And what do people want to do now? They want to move us right back into those same desperate conditions. So again, while all of that is going on, the backlash, the resistance is still there. Massive resistance in the South, violence against activists. That most of it had to do with voting. And the part that didn't have to do with voting also had to do with Black businesses and Black business persons that were still being lynched. Okay. And all of this was happening on the local level, which is why the Black community, those in the community of African descent thought, if we can get some relief from the federal level, it can help us on the local level. That's the major reason why voting on the federal level became so important. And that's why the states' rights issue is never going to go anywhere. But the reason why people of African descent wanted those voting privileges, rights and privileges, was to get relief on the local level, because on the local level, slavery was pretty much still intact. It just wasn't called that. It was called sharecropping. It was called right to work states, where the real right is I can pay you as little as I want, and you can't do anything about it. I can make your working conditions whatever is conducive to me making a profit, rather than for your personal safety. All of those things. That's what the federal government had the possibility of enacting protocols that would mitigate those kinds of circumstances. And that's what Project 2025 wanted to eliminate. And they've done a very effective job in doing that. De facto segregation persists, especially in northern cities. We used to say, because I grew up in a northern city, in the South, they don't care how close you get, as long as you don't get too big. In the North, they don't care how big you get, as long as you don't get too close. And in my neighborhood, they didn't want us either close or big. So that's been the state of affairs for our community, even in the civil rights movement. So that de facto segregation plays itself out now in school board elections, in alderman elections. Though anything that will keep the status quo, there will be people making sure that happens. In order to make sure that happens, you need money to do it. So you're not talking about the average poor folk on the street. You're talking about people in the boardrooms. That's where these decisions are being made. We're still tracking the seed of the serpent in the United States of America. Post-civil rights, affirmative action, extension of voting rights. Why are we still talking about voting rights in 75 or 82? It's because at every turn, voting rights have been under attack when it comes to people of African descent. Every time we get them, there's an active movement to take them away, because the enemy knows how important voting is. Unfortunately, they've gotten so good at what they do that our people don't know how important voting is. And therefore, we have come to the conclusion, well, voting doesn't matter. That is insane. But that is also the state of our community. And that goes back to what the Most High told us as his people. When we take our focus off him, we don't think right. But if we put our focus back on him, we understand. Our ancestors understood. So in the post-civil rights era, voting rights is still an issue. The affirmative action policies that now have been gutted were actually enacted by the Nixon administration. So they were pushed to do it. But from the very outset, what is affirmative action? Affirmative actions, just so that there can be clarity among those who are listening to this, it was to occur in two areas: education, access to an educational system that had routinely and systemically and systematically excluded large numbers of children of African descent, which is why underneath the presidency of John F. Kennedy, the university presidents across the nation had a meeting, and they were the ones that determined we're going to open up our educational institutions to more than just white. So now do you understand why somebody like Ward Connolly will come along, or Clarence Thomas will come along and speak against the very thing that allowed them to get their education so that their grandchildren can't? That's affirmative action in education. Affirmative action in the workforce. Most of the workforce is controlled by moneyed people or by mom and pop businesses. Mom and pop businesses are going to hire their family members. They're not going to hire people who don't look like them and don't act like them. The larger businesses are not going to hire people who look differently or act differently either. But the government has jobs. So the affirmative action was actually a way for aspiring, upwardly mobile, middle-class thinking Africans in America to find work. So it was the Black middle class that actually emanated from that energy. And the affirmative action policies were there to assist in that effort. It was never about quotas. The quota was, we want all white people. We don't want anybody that's not white. Well, as they're finding out, you can't run a country like that. Okay. So again, whenever those of African descent are a part of that system, the system thrives. But the people who are the moneyed people don't make enough. So it was their decision. We're going to send them all back to the poorhouse. So the affirmative action rulings were actually an act of war against the Black middle class. And unfortunately, people who were in the Black middle class weren't paying attention. So they didn't fight. And if you don't fight for your stuff, it gets taken away because you live in a society that is rapacious. And they believe that what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. And so that's where you get the anti-DEI executive orders as well. But see, all of those things, you find the way of reintroducing disenfranchisement has been systemic and systematic, and it has a name now called Project 2025, but it's the same spirit that started this country. Okay, so this is just a graphic depiction of what's being said, because what's being promoted by the people in the media. I haven't said a lot about the media. I'll just say this. The media has also been weaponized. Now, the media was always controlled by the elite, but now the elite have taken the mask off and they've taken the gloves off. The media that is 100% propaganda, whereas 50 years ago, it was not necessarily that way. You could always find some news, some objective reporting. That does not exist. So everything that you are being fed, that is what's happening. You are being fed something. So one of the things that you are being fed is that Project 2025 is to correct things that have gone wrong, being DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, excuse me, because they keep changing the name. Okay, it used to be multiculturalism, and before that, it was affirmative action, and before that, it was pluralism. The isms they just keep regurgitating the same ism. They just call it something different. Now, the reality is the green represents the consistent effort at bringing humanity to the United States of America. The red represents the consistent effort to maintain the status quo and only have humanity as identified by those who are in power. So as you can see, I'm not even going to go through this. I just wanted you to see visually what that looks like from 1776 all the way up to 2025. So that's why we're saying Project 2025 is an extension of a line that started in 1776, and actually it goes all the way back to the garden. So we're looking, the red represents the seed of the serpent. The green represents the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman is not skin color. It's the tendency to want the will of the Most High, who has created us all in his image, to be manifested in the life and times of the people that he created. And so while that is going on, and it will always go on, in this country is no different than any other country. I'm dealing with this country because that's where I live. But this same thing is going on the continent of Africa. It's going on in Europe. It's going on in Asia. It's the same thing. There's a handful of people who have taken control over the planet. They are the seed of the serpent. So they are the ones in charge of all the militaries. They're the ones in charge of all the educational systems. They're the ones that are in charge of all the financial systems. And they are the ones in charge of whether we live or die on this plane. And that's where the problem is, because that means that they are the God of this world. And that God of this world has blinded the minds of those who are not supposed to be blind. I think it's fortunate. Some people think it's unfortunate. People of African descent, you can say what you want about us. We know how to see. We see the obvious. And it is obvious that this is a satanic movement that the earth is on right now. So yes, that's why we should be looking up. That's why we should be focused on preparing for the return of the king, because the king is going to straighten all this stuff out. But in the meantime, he wants us to straighten out what we can straighten out. So we still have work to do. Well, what is the work? We're at a time of, you have to resist this stuff. You cannot let evil go unchecked, or it will run you over. It will run you down. It will run you into the ground. Now, if you're okay with that, keep ignoring it. If you're not okay with that, the Most High will give you what you need to stand in this time. And that's what he requires of his people. Father, bless you and keep you. Father, make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Father, lift up his countenance upon you and give you his shalom.